So today we are going to be talking about chords. So at long last, we've arrived at chords and chord systems. Um, I do want to talk about something else today at the end as well. So in a normal class, which is 10 weeks in the quarter, things like the final project wouldn't come up at the midterm. But because we only have 3 weeks left, I'm going to talk a little bit about the final project rubric at the end of today, and then I'll post it on GouchoSpace. So if you want to stick around at the end, we'll do a little bit of talking about that as well, just so you can start thinking about what you want to do, but that won't, of course, be due until the end of the 6th week. So triads and the diatonic system. What the heck do either of those words mean? Well, basically, we're talking about chords. Everything we've done so far has built up to this kind of final piece in the puzzle, which are chords and harmony. So there's other things we could talk about, how to construct melody, things like form, instrumentation, etc. But if we're thinking of music at its most basic elements, we've talked about rhythm, we've talked about pitch, and now we're going to talk about harmony. So basically combining vertical and horizontal components of music together. We've looked primarily at pitch from a horizontal perspective, such as in scales or in melodic intervals. The only time we've really looked at pitch vertically so far has been with harmonic intervals. Harmonic intervals are essentially chords in miniature. So a chord in its broadest term is just when simultaneous pitches sound at the same time. Two or more distinct pitches at the same time make up a chord. So there's many kinds of chords, and there's really an infinite kind of confluence of chords for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into. But we're going to focus on the chord types most common in Western music: classical music, jazz music, pop music, rock music, country, vernacular music in general, whatever. There is no such thing as knowing all of the chords. When people say that I know all the chords on this instrument or wherever, they're usually referring to the major and minor chords that we'll be talking about here. But there are other ones out there. So triads, if you recall, we very briefly would refer to intervals as dyads. I mentioned this once. Harmonic intervals especially can be thought of as being dyads, since these are two pitches acting as a unit. Di being the prefix that means two, and ad just mean two of something. When we think of chords in a colloquial sense, when any of us think of a chord, we almost always are thinking of triads specifically. We usually, when we talk about chords in just like casual conversation or like liking the chords of a song, we usually are talking about what we would consider triads in music, which are a pretty specific thing, actually. Triads are three pitches coming together as a unit. So we can think of a triad in two ways: as a standalone entity of stacked intervals, this chord exists, or as an extension of our major and minor scales. These two areas will overlap. We'll talk about both of them in tandem for the rest of the quarter. So we'll talk about chords with more than 3 notes later in the class. Specifically, we're going to talk about a type of chord called a 7th chord, which despite its name has only 4 notes in it. They are 4-note chords. We'll talk about those next week. But for right now, we're going to be talking about triads for the entirety of this week. So let's look at the chord. Here is melodic intervals, and here is those same notes as a chord. We can think of chords as stacking thirds. Essentially, 2 thirds on top of each other form the type of triads we're accustomed to. Let's just say form. So we've got a third here, we've got a third here. Whether or not it's major or minor is besides the point right now. We'll talk about that. We'll come back to that. But we have a third, we have a third. That gives us this in Western music, whether it's classical or pop or whatever. This is what we think of when we think of a triad of a chord: stacked thirds. When combined, the bottom and the top note form a fifth. That's also important to know. You have a third between the bottom and the middle, and a third between the middle and the top, and a fifth between the bottom and the top. That's just because of how we count things, starting from 1. So we've got 1, 2, 3, that's a third. 1, 2, 3, that's a fifth. And because this is counted twice in that situation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that is a fifth overall. So we can think of chord qualities just like we thought of interval qualities. So that's where knowing what these intervals are comes into play. This is what a chord looks like. This is its most kind of basic primordial essence. Chords often don't look like this in music themselves. There's a variety of reasons that we'll talk about, particularly next week, as to how we can kind of mess with what these chords look like and put them into ensembles or rearrange them or turn them into melodies. But in its purest form, this is a chord. So we use the same words to describe chord qualities that we used to describe interval qualities. The only exception is perfect. We don't have a perfect triad. That doesn't exist. Perfect is something only we use for intervals. However, we will say diminished chord, augmented chord, major chord, minor chord. Those are all fair game now. So I'm going to talk through this chart here. Our chord qualities describe two things at once: the interval quality of the bottom third and the interval quality of the outer fifth. The top third for us doesn't really matter. We're thinking of from the bottom, the third, and then the fifth. Third, fifth. So when we look at this chart here, what this represents is that if we've got a major third between the bottom and the middle note, and we've got an augmented fifth between the bottom and the top note, that's an augmented chord. It needs both of those things. So if a chord had a minor third and an augmented fifth, that's nothing. That's not something that we're going to be talking about. These are specific. These configurations have to happen. So for example, this chord here, we have an A up to a C sharp. That's a major third. We have an A up to an E. That's a perfect fifth. On our chart, major third and perfect fifth gives us an A major triad, an A major chord. For our purposes, we can use triad and chord essentially interchangeably. An A major triad. We'll go through and talk about these in a bit more succession, but basically we can think of them as, increasing levels of difficulty, or not difficulty, complexity. So notice that diminished, we've got minor and diminished, and we eventually work our way up to major and augmented. So we're kind of still straddling that quality chart in a way. So let's talk a little bit more about this further and look at some examples. So the bottom note is what's called the root of the chord. The root is the note that the chord is named for. So that's why we measure everything from the bottom. And when we don't look at the top fifth, we just look at the bottom third and then the outer fifth, because this is all in relationship to our bottom note, the root. Now, the root isn't always the same as the lowest note. We have a whole lecture all about when we change where the root is to where it's not on the bottom. The root is the root no matter where it is. But we'll look at all those intricacies in a future lecture. For right now, the root for our purposes is only going to be on the bottom. So basically, these four chord qualities are what happen when we lower and raise the different notes in the chord. We can refer to the different pitches of a chord as the chord tones. The bottom could be called the root. The middle note could be called the third, and the top note could be called the fifth. Root, third, fifth, because it's referring to those interval sizes. And notice that here, we've got four different chords, all with different accidentals. On the left, we have a diminished triad here. So a diminished triad is C up to E flat, that's a minor third, C up to G flat, that's a diminished fifth. So that's here, that's the bottom of our chart here. And that's what this sounds like. It's usually used for things like sadness, suspense, maybe terror, just depends on the circumstances. Diminished chords, okay? Now, more common than diminished chords, just like with more common than diminished intervals, are minor chords. Notice that if we have a minor third still, but a perfect fifth, we've got the fifth that appears in G minor, for instance, this would be a minor chord. Minor third, perfect fifth. Quite a bit of a different sound, not quite as intense, perhaps. So you can hear the difference here. So there is a difference. Next up, we have major. As we'll see tomorrow, especially, major is kind of the ways, as we've seen already with scales and with intervals, that we kind of derive everything else from. Major is a major third, a perfect fifth. The root, the third, and the fifth of a C major scale, for instance. It's a pretty familiar sound to all of us. Finally, if we raise the fifth, this is a rarer chord. Diminished chords we actually will see kind of a lot. Augmented chords we don't see as much. Augmented chords are quite, the word we use is dissonant, and they have this kind of ethereal kind of sound to them, and they're a little biting. They're really, really cool, and they can be used to great effect, but we don't see them a lot for reasons that we'll get to later on in the course. And also they're interesting because they perfectly divide the octave into 3 places. Basically, if we think of our 12 half steps, a major third is 3 half steps. We just do 3 major thirds essentially, and we get an octave again. So augmented triads are weird. Our ears don't like that, even though that if you look at it on paper, they're really even. So that was a bit of a digression, but in any case, the 4 chord qualities and this chart. So we'll see this chart again today. We'll continue to use this chart. Eventually, we'll want to have this chart memorized. Okay, let's see here. Is there a chord with a minor third and an augmented fifth? That's a great question. So let me put it this way. Can you play that chord? Can you write that chord? Will you see that chord? Sure. Does it have a name like this? No. Not really. And the reasons for that are complicated. The short answer is these get us unique sounding chords, different configurations of this. For instance, the suggestion of a minor third and an augmented fifth. Well, a minor third and an augmented fifth sounds kind of like just a different chord with a different note on the bottom. So we'll talk about that later on, but it's the short answer is no, we don't have a name for that. Can you repeat the 2 versions of a triad? Oh, okay. Yeah. Let me go back a slide really quick. Sorry, everybody. Okay. No. Okay. So what we were just talking about is building chords as if they're just stacked intervals, removed of context. So that's one way to think about triads. These aren't necessarily 2 different kinds of triads because they overlap, as we'll see. Later on in this class and throughout the rest of the week, we'll talk about also relating our chords back to major and minor scales, where instead of thinking of building an interval, we can think of it as going, well, if I have a C major scale, I just need this note, this note, and this note, and then that makes a triad. So that's what I mean by 2 different ways of thinking about it. This is what gets to the other part of today's title, which is diatonic, the diatonic system. So we'll come to that a little bit later. Right now, we're focusing on primarily this first way, which is standalone entities consisting of stacked intervals. So hopefully that answered your question. Great question so far. Other questions? Let me go back to this slide. We're going to hear a bunch of chords really quick. Okay. Other questions before we move on? These are good questions so far. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on then. So let's do some practice identifying chord qualities. So for your convenience, I have reproduced the chart here. So look at the third first, the middle note, then look at the fifth, the top note, the third, the fifth. So take a look at this chord, take 30 seconds. Essentially, all I'm asking you to do right now is to identify 2 intervals and then relate them back to this chart. So take 30 seconds. Okay, let's just jump in the deep end with this. Let's try this out. So we know that the chord is named for the note on the bottom, which in this case is F. This is an F chord of some kind. Somebody drop in the chat, anybody who's got it, what quality is this chord? This is an F what? I see 2 majors, major, 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 major. Indeed, this is an F major triad. We would call this an F major chord. F up to A is a major third, and F up to C is a perfect fifth. Therefore, this is a major chord, as we can see on our chart there. Okay, try this one out now. Try this one out. Okay, so what do we got for this one? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. And if you still don't know, the odds of getting it right just by a random guess are 25%. It's a B flat chord of some kind, also major, minor, minor. Okay, there's a little bit of descent there. Okay, let's go ahead and look at this. So this pertains to our intervals, of course. If we have B flat up to D flat, B flat up to D flat is a minor third. So that narrows us down. We can basically think this is like a flow chart. We can do one of two things. We can start with the fifth or start with the third. Because if we know what one of those are, it'll narrow us down to half of the options already. So let's say we start from the third. If it's a minor third, B flat to D flat, well, that means it's going to be one of these two down here. So the question is, if we have a minor third in the bottom, do we have a perfect fifth in the top? The answer is yes. B flat up to F is a perfect fifth, whereas if it would be an F flat if it were diminished. The other way to go it is you can go, well, B flat to F, I know is a perfect fifth. You can start here and you go, well, I know it can't be augmented or it can't be diminished. There's kind of ways to narrow it down quickly, especially if we're doing lots of these in succession. Okay. Does that, yeah, that wasn't really a question. It was more just like, you know, anyways. Okay. This is a B flat minor chord. Okay. Try this one now. Try this one. Okay. Let's talk through this one together. Let's start with the fifth first, just as an exercise. D flat up to A flat. Well, we know that in D flat major or minor, the fifth would be the same. It would be perfect if it was the A that we have in D flat major or minor. So if we think of a D flat major or minor scale, doesn't really matter. D flat has 5 flats. We know that one of those 5 flats is A flat. If this is the flat we have there, that's a perfect fifth. So if that's a perfect fifth, that narrows us down to these two middle options. Is this a major third or a minor third between D flat and F? Well, now let's think of our scales again. Is this the F we have in major or the F we have in minor? This is in fact the F we have in major. Therefore, this is a major chord. Now, try this one out. Try this one out. 30 seconds. Okay, what do we got? Put it in chat. What do we think for this one? And again, this might not be enough time, and that's okay. Even if you get half of it right, you can still narrow it down, and we'll get faster the more that we do this. So what do we got? It's a G flat chord of some kind. That's a pretty gnarly root. I see a guess for augmented. Okay, other guesses? I see another augmented, 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 augmented. Indeed, yes. Excellent job. That is in fact an augmented chord. So it depends, it doesn't really matter how you get there. If you start with your outer fifth and go, well, let me see, is it a perfect fifth or not? If you go G flat up to D, well, G flat up to D is an augmented fifth to start with. So that automatically narrows it down to being just an augmented triad for our purposes. If you look, you have a major third between G flat and B flat, and an augmented fifth between G flat and D natural. If it were a D flat, that would be a perfect fifth, but it's not. It's an augmented chord. So very nice job. Yes. So we'll do two more, and let me know, if we want more time, just either put in the chat or private message me. I'm happy to give us more time if you want. Let's do two more. Try this one out now. Okay, would we like more time? Are we all set to try this out? I'm taking silence as that we're good. But again, feel free to stop me. Okay, what do we got for this one? Let's take some guesses. It's an F sharp chord of some kind. F sharp's the root. Major, minor, augmented, diminished. What do we got? I see minor, I see minor, I see minor. Yes, very nice work. Indeed, this is minor. It's minor because we have F sharp to A, that's a minor third. F sharp to C sharp, that is a perfect fifth. Therefore, minor. One more. Try this one out. Okay. What do we got? What are we thinking guess-wise? I see diminished. I see diminished. Yeah, if you want to play the education meta, I guess you could go, well, we haven't seen one of these yet. It is in fact diminished. That's right. So if we have a minor third between E and G, and then we have a diminished fifth between E and B. So once again, the fifths are a pretty good way to narrow things down, but we often think of things bottom up. So however you go there, you'll get the same answer. So yeah, E up to B flat is in fact a diminished fifth, not a perfect fifth. It would be a B natural if it were perfect. Yeah. Okay, any questions on this, on identification? Okay, feel free to stop me as we keep going on. So let's now write some triads. So we'll do the exact same thing, but now instead of identifying them, I'm going to give you the chord quality, and I want you to write the notes above, depending on what I'm asking for. So in this case, I'm asking for major. So take C sharp and turn C sharp into a major chord over here. C sharp into a major chord. Go ahead and take a minute for this first one. Take a minute. Okay, so I'm going to reveal this one. I'll talk through it a bit. So if we know that we're going to be making a major chord, we could go, okay, well, we know that if we need a major third and a perfect fifth, that those are both notes that we have in a C sharp major scale. So we could perhaps build C sharp major and then just go, okay, the first note, the third note, the fifth note, and we would get something a little bit like this. You could also think of it granularly. I know I need to go from C up to an E of some kind. What E would give me a major third? From C up to G of some kind, what G would give me a perfect fifth? That would be E sharp and G sharp respectively. So there you go. Try this one out. Try this one out. So make a diminished chord. Make a diminished chord. Take another minute for this one, and then we'll come back together and take a look at that. Diminished chord. Okay, so what do we got? For this one, I'll take some feedback from all of you. So in the chat, if we know we have D, type out the three notes that we need to make this a diminished chord. Okay. See some responses coming in. They all seem to agree so far. Great. Indeed. D, F natural, A flat. We know that D up to F is a minor third. D up to A would be a perfect fifth. So we need to lower that down a half step. D up to A flat gives us a diminished chord here. Okay, great. Do another one. Minor. Okay. So we have a G. We know that because we need a third and a fifth, it's going to be a G, a B, and a D of some kind. So go ahead and type in the chat, what are the three notes we need to make this a minor chord? To make this the root of the minor chord. Okay, thank you. I see G, B flat, and D. G, B flat, and D. Blah, 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 blah. There seems to be some consensus. Okay, indeed, that is correct. G up to B flat is a minor third. G up to D is a perfect fifth. So this is kind of like the notes that we have if we had one scale degrees 1, 3, and 5 in a minor scale. That would be the same as a minor chord here. Okay, major. I think we've got three more of these. Major, A flat in the bass. Okay, what do we got? Type the 3 notes that we need in the chat, which include A flat as your root. What do we got? Okay, one response came in. There's some consensus. Anybody else? Yeah, that's right. So if we have A flat in the bottom, we know we're going to need a third and a fifth. That'll be a C of some kind and an E of some kind. So if we know it's a major chord, we'll need a major third between A flat and C. In this case, that happens to be C natural, as we know from last week with intervals. A flat up to E flats, well, that's also a perfect fifth. We need to lower it. If it were A flat up to E natural, that would be augmented. That would give us an augmented chord, but that's not what we want. We want a major chord. So we have A flat, C, E flat. Now, speaking of augmented, here we are. Build an augmented chord with A as your root, with A. Okay, so just like before, we need an A of some kind, a C of some kind, an E of some kind. What do we got? What do we need? Okay, one response in the chat. Okay. What are we thinking? Yeah, so A, C sharp, and E sharp. That gives us an augmented triad here. A up to C sharp is a major third. A up to E sharp is an augmented fifth. Major third, augmented fifth. That is an A augmented chord. Okay, one more. Diminished, starting on B natural. Okay. We need a B of some kind, a D of some kind, an F of some kind. That gives us a root, a third, and a fifth. What do we got? BDF, BDF. Yeah, so in this case, we actually don't need anything. Oh, wait, that's... Well, I just made it wrong. It should be an F natural. I'll fix it on the slide. Let's just do this. What I've written here is, in fact, minor. So sorry, everybody. Oh, and it's gone. I'll fix it later. Sorry about that. My mistake. I saw a question in the chat. So yeah, BDF would give you diminished. This is accidentally minor. I'll fix that. There's a question in the chat that I didn't realize before I muted myself. So the question is isn't E sharp just F with relation to this? It sounds the same as F, but the problem is that E sharp is not the same as F in that we need a fifth. E gives us a fifth between A and E, A, B, C, D, E. But if we do an F, A, B, C, D, E, F, we've changed it. And now it's no longer a triad where A is the root. We'll see this more as we continue throughout, but the enharmonic pitches, so B sharp, for instance, C flat, E sharp, F flat, they actually are really important for things like this, even though that they sound the same on a pitch level. Yeah, I'll make sure to fix that. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay, so let's talk about the diatonic system very briefly. We've been looking at chords now, just like stacking them from nothing. Here's a chord, it exists. We may relate them to major and minor scales in the process, but it's just a chord floating. However, much of what we often see is written in a specific key. A piece could be in B flat, in C, in D, in A, whatever. So we can think of triads as coming from our major and minor scales, where we build triads on top of each of our scale degrees. So this is called the diatonic system, from the words dia meaning 7 and tonic meaning tone. You'll hear the word diatonic a lot, especially if you're a music major or music minor and continue on. Diatonic music is the majority of any Western system. We have 7 notes in our scale, diatonic system. So we'll label these chords eventually. We're going to spend 2 days this week talking about how to label them in 2 different ways. But for right now, let's just go ahead and focus on the chord qualities that we get by building chords in a key. So we have a B flat scale here. Whole half. We've got our key signature there, etc. If we were to take all those notes and acknowledge our key signature and just build root third fifth, root third fifth, root third fifth above each of our notes in a triad, we now get chords that are all united within a key, within shared accidentals. And this is often how a lot of music is written. So make sure to keep track of your key signature whenever you're doing things like this. And we'll do things like this later on in the week, especially. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. And now we've got chord qualities that arise. So I've just put them here for you. We could have gone through and done them one by one. B flat up to D, B flat up to F, major. C up to E flat, C up to G, minor. D up to F, D up to A, minor, and so on. And notice that we have a diminished chord here. The 7th scale degree is going to be a diminished chord if you build it out as a chord. A up to C up to E flat, that's a diminished triad. So that's why I said that diminished occur more frequently, more regularly than augmented chords do, because of that right there. This pattern, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, is the same in any major key. So I don't want to overwhelm us today. So for the sake of time, we're just going to leave it at that and just talk about major. We'll return to minor later on in the week, but this is the same. If you're in C major, if you build a chord from the 3rd scale degree, it's going to be a minor chord. If you're in F sharp major, if you build a triad starting on your 5th scale degree, that'll be a major chord without fail. That's just how that works. So we'll talk about minor later. The pattern, of course, changes for minor, as we would probably expect. But this is kind of going to eventually become a bigger part of what the end of this week will look like. So we're going to talk about labeling chords tomorrow. We'll talk about labeling chords again on Wednesday, and then we'll kind of continue with the diatonic system and reintroduce minor into the equation. So let's talk about what we're going to do next time. So we're going to be talking about our first system of labeling chords. We call these lead sheet symbols. After that, we'll look at another way that we think of chords, which is called, well, Roman numerals are just a thing, but we use Roman numerals in a very specific way in music theory and in just music performance and analysis and whatever. So we'll talk about both of these. And then after that, we'll look at what happens when we rearrange the notes in the chord. So as you know, in music, chords are rarely just a triad like the ones we've been looking at. So we'll also involve minor throughout this process as well. So I know that we're getting out of here quite a bit early, but there is just so much today. I didn't want to inundate us. I could have easily gone into minor, but I didn't want to overdo it. As always, your homework is posted, so you do have some space to practice if you'd like. If you want to get started on that, you can do a lot of what we've done today already on the homework assignment. And I'm going to open the floor for questions right now, but I will also say that if you would like to stick around, I'm going to go ahead and do a bit of an overview of your final project for this class. It won't be due for another 3 weeks or so until the end of the quarter, but you can start thinking about this, and I have a rubric I'll be posting in the Gadget Space. So before we move on to that, are there any questions about what we talked about today? So the fundamentals of building a major, minor, augmented, or diminished triads from a given note. Any questions? As you can kind of see, as I've been trying to emphasize throughout the course, everything builds so much that it can get really difficult if, say, you're a little shaky on your intervals. Well, chords are going to be difficult, or if you're a little shaky on scales, intervals will be difficult, and it kind of all trickles. So, if this is still a little shaky, then, we still have some time to practice, and we'll still have more opportunities to kind of dig into this stuff. So things will get a little bit smoother as the process goes on. So hopefully I've stalled enough for time. I don't see any questions in the chat. I do have office hours today. I will be holding my regular office hours. I'll take a quick break and then start up again at 2 o'clock and have office hours. So if anybody wants to come and get some one-on-one attention or do some more practice, just feel free to stop by. So let's go ahead now and look at the rubric that I have made here for your final project. So your final project is not in 2 parts. You have 2 options for it. So I'm going to talk about both options in succession. They both have different requirements because they're kind of wildly different things that are all related to our class. So this will be due in the final week of the class. So you will have a final exam like your midterm and a final project, but your final project can be started now if you wanted it to. So you have 2 options. You can either compose a piece of music. Let me make this a little bit bigger. It's a little small. You can compose a piece of music or write a paper about a piece of music. Now, I'm just going to say right off the bat, the instinct is if you don't like writing, well, first of all, they both will have writing. So sorry. But also, composition and writing are both difficult in very different ways. There is no easier or quicker option. So these are kind of designed to be the same length. And students that often compose often take a lot more time on it, but it can often be a more fulfilling kind of endeavor. It can just be a little bit, headache inducing, whereas this is actually the more straightforward option of the 2. So I love it when students do either. There's been really great versions of either paper in this class. So there's no distinction. Either is fine. Let's talk about composition first. So composition, you must have a composition of your own design. So something original that meets the following criteria. Has a clearly defined time and key signature. It needs to have a key signature. It needs to have a time signature. It has to have a melody. It needs to have what's called harmonic accompaniment. Before today, we could not talk about this, but as this week proceeds, we will understand what this means. Basically, I need some sort of chordal information, some harmonic information. So you could either have this as a piano and put chords in the left hand, or you could just write a melody and put lead sheet symbols or Roman numerals, which we'll talk about tomorrow and Wednesday, respectively, on top. Either is fine. You could just write a melody and put the chords on top, or you could be a little bit more intricate. You must use a variety of rhythms, so at least 4 different types of rhythm. What I mean by types of rhythm is quite simply, it can't all just be quarter notes. You need to have, if you're going to be in 4/4, it needs to have a quarter note, an 8th note, a 16th note, and a whole note or something. And it needs to be at least 16 measures long. So just depending on your tempo, that's quite short, actually. So beyond these expectations, there's a lot of freedom for what this can be. This is designed to be widely applicable. Other versions of this class have students write out like chorales or like classical models. And it's like, that's not useful for everybody. So this can be as useful to you as you want it to be. So you could write a melody in an instrument like flute and just put the chord symbols above. You could write the piece for string quartet and actually write out 4 individual parts that all together form the chords, and where one has the melody. That's more intricate, but if that's what you're into, go for it. Style, instrumentation, and other possibilities are left up to your creativity. As long as a score is submitted with the minimum requirements, anything goes. So it truly is up to you. If you want lyrics, I didn't even mention that in here. Like you can include lyrics on it if you want to go for more of a singer-songwriter type. Totally fine, no worries. So you will submit your composition as a PDF with a 500-word write-up in docx format. That is a format that is readable by Microsoft Word. You all have access to Microsoft Office as UCSB students, so this should not be hard to get a hold of. This write-up is an informal essay. where you explain some of your choices, refer to it, relate to the composition to concepts from the class, and provide extra context. So talk about your decisions, relate what you've done on the page to what we talked about in the classroom, and just other things that, you know, are part of the process. Can the composition be a variation on an already existing theme or piece? I'm gonna say yes if it's approved ahead of time. So stop by or shoot me an email or ask me. I will, with reservations, yes, that is possible. So the word for that is what we call an arrangement. So arrangements are taking a piece of music that exists and redoing some stuff. Arrangement is an extremely useful process, but this is not a lot of this. Arranging could be very straightforward. And I want this to be not as, like, I want this to be original from your own creativity. So within reason, just, yeah, if you want to kind of embellish a piece that has already been written, just get it approved by me ahead of time. We can chat about that. So yeah. You may be wondering how you would submit your composition as a PDF. Well, you could write it on printed manuscript paper. You can find blank sheet music online to print out, or you could use a free software like MuseScore, which I have, I think in the syllabus I also put information on MuseScore. And you could, like the examples that I make for class, you could also write out your piece. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. You all know what A work is, you all know what B work is, and so on. I don't go lower than C for descriptions because it's like, you know, if it's worse than a C, it's going to be worse than a C. So at the end of the day, what you need is all the requirements, a polished composition. It doesn't look like a mess. If you're submitting something that we can read, that is legible. And then your write-up provides details and insights on your piece that relates back to course concepts and is free of grammatical and factual errors. So shoot for this. I included B and C for your own as an FYI, but shoot for A. Okay, so let's talk about the other thing. So let's talk about analysis. We'll talk about analysis. Basically, write a paper that analyzes a piece of music of your choosing. So it doesn't matter what it is, doesn't matter where it came from. Access to notation isn't required, but is recommended. So as we've been doing in the listening journals, you don't always need a score, but it helps. And we've been finding ways to work with scores, or to work without scores through like MuseScore and stuff like that. So reach out to me or your TA if you have any questions tracking down a score. Provide a link to a Spotify link or YouTube with your essay, because if there's no access to a score, you'll be able to keep track using time codes. But even if you do have a score, include a link just so we can listen along. Integrate course concepts into the description of your piece. So think of analysis as quote unquote informed description. So for example, say you want to look at I'm Still Standing, a piece that we've already looked at in class. Your piece can discuss things like what scale the melody uses at different points, what key the piece is in, what kind of rhythms John uses, and so on. So there's the types of concepts you relate your piece to will depend on the piece itself. So you can't necessarily talk about everything for every piece. Every piece is different. So there's lots of freedom in what you can focus on. So you have to incorporate some detail about some things, but like say the rhythm in your piece isn't super interesting. Well, you don't have to talk about it then. That's fine. So this is going to be a longer write-up, 1250 to 1500 words. Not terribly too bad. It's a formal structure with an introduction and conclusion. Check your work for grammatical errors. I'm okay if your tone is a little bit more relaxed, as long as it's got a formal structure. It should rely primarily on your musical observations and their relevance to course concepts. If you include outside sources, cite them. If you want to pull up an interview where somebody talks about how they wrote the piece, fine, cite it. If you use a score, include it. So attach a PDF. And yeah, your paper brings up a wealth of analytical observations. You bring up many course concepts and describe them in great detail. You integrate musical numbers if using a score, or time codes to keep track of your observations in a piece. The musical numbers just mean the measure numbers, that is. And your essay has minimal grammatical and factual errors. So any questions on that? I'll be posting this to GotchaSpace this afternoon. You will have 3 weeks basically from now, maybe actually more than that, technically. You've got some time to think about this, so play around with it. And just so you know, the listening journals have been helping you practice this the whole quarter. You've got another one due today if you haven't looked at that yet. So the listening journals are a way to already write about music in a sense. So you could build off of a listening journal for your analysis paper, for instance. That's totally fine. In addition, week 6, if you look at the syllabus, is primarily workshops about these different parts of your final project. We'll spend 2 days talking about how to write music. We'll spend 2 days talking about how to analyze music. So week 6 is going to be kind of just tying things all together. And we're basically done with course concepts at that point for the most part. So this is really the second to last week of material as far as like, what is this? What is this? All the terminology and stuff. So any questions on that? Like I said, I'll be posting this for Gotcha Space for you to reference.
So what is the technical definition of melody again?
Oh, sure. Theory? Sure. That's fine. Melody is just, we haven't talked much about melody. We might talk a little bit about that in that 6th week, but melody is basically just like a line that has varied rhythms, varied intervals, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The melody is the part of music that is, if it's with like voice, the voice sings the melody. In an orchestra, the melody is usually in the top part. The melody is the most prominent part of the piece. So everything else is usually supporting the melody.
So it's kind of like how do you say, the chorus, right?
That's kind of a different thing. Chorus relates to like form and formal sections. So like if we think of like verses and choruses in a piece of music that is written with like that, you'll have verses that are sections that all sound the same, and then choruses, and those sections will alternate back and forth. And the melody for each of those sections will be different, for instance.
Okay, got it. Thank you for explaining.
Yeah. That's a really great question. Like I said, we'll have time to talk about some of this stuff in week 6, especially as you're working on your own work. And again, if you want to ever stop by office hours or email me, I'm happy to answer some of these questions too. So yeah, other questions? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording at this point.